Hi, my name is Bill Braniff. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing the enabling behaviors that enable and sustain terrorist operations over time. We tend to think about terrorism as the violent incident itself, the bomb going off. In reality, in order for an organization to be able to conduct this attack, there's a whole host of supporting activities that have to have happened ahead of time. And for a terrorist organization to be most successful, they need not just to be able to generate one attack, but a campaign of violence. Because remember, terrorism is about violence and the threat of future violence. And if you can credibly threaten future violence, violence tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, you have a greater likelihood of achieving your strategic goals, of changing the behavior of your adversaries. We're going to examine this through the lens of the East African Al-Qaeda cell, and specifically the complex suicide attack that occurs in August of 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania. And I think this case study highlights two things. First, the system of violence and all the supporting behaviors that need to take place. And second, the idea that for an individual perpetrator to become a terrorist, there's also a life journey, a story that unfolds, that puts that person in a position to have the capability, the motivation, and the opportunity to conduct that attack. So we're going to look at Abdullah Mohammed Fazul, also known as Harun Fazul, and his life journey that puts him into the East African Al-Qaeda cell as the key logistics node in 1998. His story really starts in the Comoros Islands, his birthplace, a set of islands off of southeastern Africa. The traditional Islam practiced in the Comoros is not puritanical or radical in any way, but at age 16, despite coming from a very moderate family, Harun Fazul attends the Soydiki Madrasa. And this is where his indoctrination really begins. He is awarded a scholarship to travel to Pakistan to continue to study Islam. And it is very shortly after his arrival in Pakistan that he's recruited by an Al-Qaeda recruiter, suggesting that he had been identified as a good candidate for recruitment earlier. He's then brought into Al-Qaeda's safe haven, the infrastructure along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border that's comprised of safe houses, training complexes. So in this case, it's a physical safe haven. It's the kind of safe haven I think we think of when we think of terrorist safe havens. It's remote, it's outside of the reach of government, and in that safe haven you have a place to do the logistics that need to be done. Facilitating travel, procuring material, conducting training, networking, indoctrinating further, these sorts of activities. It's important to remember that safe haven can also be a virtual space. It can be a space in an inner city or in the suburbs of a city where there's a lot of turnover, a lot of people moving in and moving out of that community, meaning that everyone has a degree of anonymity and can move with some degree of freedom. So safe haven can take many different forms. In this case, it does take the form of a remote physical location really outside of the rule of national law. He's trained for months there. He has an affinity for what he is doing, and eventually he's deployed as part of the East African Al-Qaeda cell to East Africa. Ultimately, this cell will operate out of Kenya, but they are first sent to Somalia to try to make inroads with an Islamist movement called Al-Ittihad al-Islami. And we'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of the composition of the cell, Harun Fazul was the primary logistics node for eventually the plot that would become the Kenyan embassy bombing. In that capacity, he would rent a hotel room that would become the lab for the bomb making. He would rent the truck and drive the lead vehicle to the site of the explosion. The bomb truck would follow his lead. He was also deployed with Ali Mohammed. Ali Mohammed is one of the key operatives for Al-Qaeda in this time period. He was a U.S. citizen, noticeably. He served in the United States Army. He also had run-ins with the intelligence community in the United States on multiple occasions. Ali Mohammed would spend years conducting reconnaissance and surveillance in East Africa, building target packages for different targets, ultimately settling on the embassies for this particular attack, suggesting that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of reconnaissance and surveillance as an enabling behavior for terrorist attacks, especially complex ones like this particular incident. The cell leader was Wadi al-Hajj. He had two responsibilities. The first was to make the East African al-Qaeda cell financially self-sufficient, and he attempted to do this by establishing fraudulent charities as well as fraudulent companies, dealing in things like the gemstone, illegal gemstone trade. His second responsibility was to serve as the communication node back to al-Qaeda core. And he did this through an intermediary, an overt organization based in the United Kingdom. On the side, covertly, they were also communicating back to al-Qaeda core from the East African al-Qaeda cell. So you see there are multiple processes in place that were meant to make the East African al-Qaeda cell a lasting or enduring network. This was not to be a one-off attack. They were meant to establish roots that would allow a campaign of violence to be waged over time. Now, I mentioned that Harun Fazul and the cell initially tried to make inroads in Somalia. Their goal was to create alliances, and alliances specifically at the time with a group called Al-Ittihad al-Islami. This was an Islamist network that was primarily focused on Somalia, so creating an Islamic government in Somalia. It was roundly defeated by other entities within Somalia. Its membership would later on become some key members of the Islamic Courts Union. These Islamic courts were set up in the absence of a federal government to try to govern, locally at first. Eventually they were networked together to create the Council of Islamic Courts, run out of Mogadishu. And that particular Islamic court, run out of Mogadishu, had a subordinate militia that was meant to enforce their decisions, and it was called Al-Shabaab, or the Youth. This militia would become the terrorist organization that we know today, and that formally affiliated with al-Qaeda many years later. Well, Harun Fazul would have long-lasting interactions with Al-Ittihad al-Islami and eventually Al-Shabaab, fundamentally reorienting the nature of the violence that came out of those networks, from nationalist in agenda to both nationalist and transnational. We now see Al-Shabaab conducting attacks outside of Somalia itself and being part of the global jihadist network with connections to other al-Qaeda associated and affiliated groups. So the implications, the long-term implications of the presence of the East African al-Qaeda cell are tremendous, even beyond the level of violence that they created with the East African bombing attack itself. So on August 7th, 1998, Harun Fazul would lead the attack that occurred on the Kenyan embassy. This is an act of international war to attack embassies abroad. So a significant attack, but I think its significance can distract us from the fact that there was a system of violence at play that had to enable it. And the last ingredient of this system of violence is money or financing. It turns out that along Harun Fazul's life journey and the evolution of this plot, there was a fundraising node called Al-Haramain Foundation. And this is a common word, but this particular foundation had 14 locations globally. It was based out of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And Al-Haramain Foundation funded Al-Ittihad al-Islami in Somalia. It funded the Soydiki Madrasa, where Harun Fazul was originally or initially indoctrinated. And it funded his travel to Pakistan, where he was quickly recruited. This is the lubricant that greases the engine of violence. It generated not just this attack, but also generated the attack on the hotel in Mombasa, the failed attack against the El Al airline. Harun Fazul and Ali Mohammed would go on to train the 9/11 hijackers and reorient the violence of the nature of violence in Somalia. So you could see that effective counterterrorism can't just be focused on the violent plot itself. Instead, it has to understand that mitigating these various supporting nodes is really what professional counterterrorism is about. Because if you're able to do that, you can successfully mitigate the lethality and the frequency of violent attacks that make up campaigns of violence over time.